April 17. At 8 o'clock, the concierge buttonholed the doctor as he was going out. Some young scallywags, he said, had dumped 3 dead rats in the hall. They'd obviously been caught in traps with very strong springs, as they were bleeding profusely. The concierge had lingered in the doorway for quite a while, holding the rats by their legs and keeping a sharp eye on the passers-by, on the off chance that the miscreants would give themselves away by grinning or by some facetious remark. His watch had been in vain. "But I'll nab 'em all right," said Monsieur Michel hopefully. The invalid was an old Spaniard with a hard, rugged face. Placed on the coverlet in front of him were 2 pots containing dried peas. When the doctor entered, the old man was sitting up, bending his neck back, gasping and wheezing in his efforts to recover his breath. His wife brought a bowl of water. "Well, doctor," he said, while the injection was being made, "they're coming out. Have you noticed?" "The rats, he means," his wife explained. "The man next door found 3. They're coming out. You can see them in all the trash cans. It's hunger." On April 28, when the Ronstock Bureau announced that 8,000 rats had been collected, a wave of something like panic swept the town. There was a demand for drastic measures. The authorities were accused of slackness. And people who had houses on the coast spoke of moving there, early in the year though it was. But next day the Bureau informed them that the phenomenon had abruptly ended, and the sanitary service had collected only a trifling number of rats. Everyone breathed more freely. It was, however, on this same day at noon that Dr. Rieux, when parking his car in front of the apartment house where he lived, noticed the concierge coming toward him from the end of the street. He was dragging himself along, his head bent, arms and legs curiously splayed out, with the jerky movements of a clockwork doll. The old man was leaning on the arm of a priest whom the doctor knew. It was Father Panlu, a learned and militant Jesuit, whom he had met occasionally, and who was very highly thought of in our town, even in circles quite indifferent to religion. Rieux waited for the 2 men to draw up to him. Monsieur Michel's eyes were fever-bright, and he was breathing wheezily. The old man explained that, feeling a bit off color, he had gone out to take the air, but he had started feeling pains in all sorts of places, in his neck, armpits, and groin, and had been obliged to turn back and ask Father Panlu to give him an arm. "It's just swellings," he said. "I must have strained myself somehow." Leaning out of the window of the car, the doctor ran his hand over the base of Michel's neck. A hard lump, like a knot in wood, had formed there. "Go to bed at once and take your temperature. I'll come to see you this afternoon." When the old man had gone, Rieux asked Father Panlu what he made of this queer business about the rats. "Oh, I suppose it's an epidemic they've been having." The father's eyes were smiling behind his big round glasses. After lunch, while Rieux was reading for the 2nd time the telegram his wife had sent him from the sanatorium announcing her arrival, the phone rang. It was one of his former patients, a clerk in the municipal office, ringing him up. He had suffered for a long time from a constriction of the aorta, and, as he was poor, Rieux had charged no fee. "Thanks, doctor, for remembering me. But this time it's somebody else. The man next door's had an accident. Please, come at once." He sounded out of breath. Rieux thought quickly. Yes, he could see the concierge afterwards. A few minutes later he was entering a small house in the Rue Fedeb, on the outskirts of the town. Halfway up the draughty, foul-smelling stairs, he saw Joseph Grand, the clerk, hurrying down to meet him. He was a man of about 50 years of age, tall and drooping, with narrow shoulders, thin limbs, and a yellowish moustache. "He looks better now," he told Rieux, "but I really thought his number was up." He blew his nose vigorously. On the top floor, the 3rd, Rieux noticed something scrawled in red chalk on a door on the left. "Come in. I've hanged myself." They entered the room. A rope dangled from a hanging lamp above a chair lying on its side. The dining-room table had been pushed into a corner. but the rope hung empty. I got him down just in time. Grand seemed always to have trouble in finding his words, though he expressed himself in the simplest possible way. I was going out, and I heard a noise. When I saw that writing on the door, I thought it was a prank. Only, then I heard a funny sort of groan. It made my blood run cold, as they say. He scratched his head. That must be a painful way of doing it, I should think. Naturally, I went in. Grand had opened a door, and they were standing on the threshold of a bright but scantily furnished bedroom. There was a brass bedstead against one of the walls, and a plump little man was lying there, breathing heavily. He gazed at them with bloodshot eyes. Rieux stopped short. In the intervals of the man's breathing, he seemed to hear the little squeals of rats, but he couldn't see anything moving in the corners of the room. Then he went to the bedside. Evidently the man had not fallen from a sufficient height, or very suddenly, for the collarbone had held. Naturally, there was some asphyxia. An X-ray photograph would be needed. Meanwhile, the doctor gave him a camphor injection and assured him he would be all right in a few days. "Thanks, doctor," the man mumbled. When Rieux asked Grand if he had notified the police, he hung his head. "Well, as a matter of fact, I haven't. The first thing I thought was to—" "Quite so," Rieux cut in. "I'll see to it." But the invalid made a fretful gesture and sat up in bed. He felt much better, he explained. Really, it wasn't worth the trouble. "Don't feel alarmed," Rieux said. "It's little more than a formality. Anyhow, I have to report this to the police." "Oh." The man slumped back on the bed and started sobbing weakly. Grand, who had been twiddling his moustache while they were speaking, went up to the bed. "Come, Monsieur Cottard," he said. "Try to understand. People could say the doctor was to blame if you took it into your head to have another shot at it." Cottard assured him tearfully that there wasn't the least risk of that. He'd had a sort of crazy fit, but it had passed, and all he wanted now was to be left in peace. Rieux was writing a prescription. "Very well," he said. "We'll say no more about it for the present. I'll come and see you again in a day or two. But don't do anything silly." On the landing he told Grand that he was obliged to make a report, but would ask the police inspector to hold up the inquiry for a couple of days. "But somebody should watch Cottard tonight," he added. "Has he any relations?" "Not that I know of, but I can very well stay with him. I can't say I really know him, but one's got to help a neighbor, hasn't one?" As he walked down the stairs, Rieux caught himself glancing into the darker corners, and he asked Grand if the rats had quite disappeared in his part of the town. Grand had no idea. True, he'd heard some talk about rats, but he never paid much attention to gossip like that. "I've other things to think about," he added. Rieux, who was in a hurry to get away, was already shaking his hand. There was a letter to write to his wife, and he wanted to see the concierge first. News vendors were shouting the latest news, that the rats had disappeared. But Rieux found his patient leaning over the edge of the bed, one hand pressed to his belly and the other to his neck, vomiting pinkish bile into a slop pail. After retching for some minutes, the man lay back again, gasping. His temperature was 103, the ganglia of his neck and limbs were swollen, and 2 black patches were developing on his thighs. He now complained of internal pains. "It's like fire," he whimpered. "The bastard's burning me inside." He could hardly get the words through his fever-crusted lips, and he gazed at the doctor with bulging eyes that his headache had suffused with tears. His wife cast an anxious look at Rieux, who said nothing. "Please, doctor," she said. "What is it?" "It might be almost anything. There's nothing definite as yet. Keep him on a light diet and give him plenty to drink." The sick man had been complaining of a raging thirst. On returning to his apartment, Rieux rang up his colleague Richard, one of the leading practitioners in the town. "No," Richard said. "I can't say I've noticed anything exceptional." "No cases of fever with local inflammation?" "Wait a bit. I have 2 cases with inflamed ganglia. Abnormally so? Well, Richard said, that depends on what you mean by normal. Anyhow, that night the porter was running a temperature of 104 and in delirium, always babbling about them rats. Rieux tried a fixation abscess. When he felt the sting of the turpentine, the old man yelled, "The bastards!" The ganglia had become still larger and felt like lumps of solid fibrous matter embedded in the flesh. Madame Michel had completely broken down. "Sit up with him," the doctor said, "and call me if necessary." Next day, April 30, the sky was blue and slightly misty. A warm, gentle breeze was blowing, bringing with it a smell of flowers from the outlying suburbs. The morning noises of the street sounded louder, gayer than usual. For everyone in our little town, this day brought the promise of a new lease on life, now that the shadow of fear under which they had been living for a week had lifted. Rieux, too, was in an optimistic mood when he went down to see the concierge. He had been cheered up by a letter from his wife that had come with the first mail. Old Monsieur Michel's temperature had gone down to 99, and though he still looked very weak, he was smiling. "He's better, Doctor, isn't he?" his wife inquired. "Well, it's a bit too early to say." At noon, the sick man's temperature shot up abruptly to 104. He was in constant delirium and had started vomiting again. The ganglia in the neck were painful to the touch, and the old man seemed to be straining to hold his head as far as possible from his body. His wife sat at the foot of the bed, her hands on the counterpane, gently clasping his feet. She gazed at Rieux imploringly. "Listen," he said, "we'll have to move him to a hospital and try special treatment. I'll ring up for the ambulance." 2 hours later, the doctor and Madame Michel were in the ambulance bending over the sick man. Rambling words were issuing from the gaping mouth, thickly coated now with sordise. He kept on repeating, "Them rats! Them damned rats!" His face had gone livid, a grayish green. His lips were bloodless. His breath came in sudden gasps. His limbs spread out by the ganglia, embedded in the berth as if he were trying to bury himself in it, or a voice from the depths of the earth was summoning him below. The unhappy man seemed to be stifling under some unseen pressure. His wife was sobbing. "Isn't there any hope left, Doctor?" "He's dead," said Rieux. Michel's death marked, one might say, the end of the first period, that of bewildering portents, and the beginning of another, relatively more trying, in which the perplexity of the early days gradually gave place to panic. Reviewing that first phase in the light of subsequent events, our townsfolk realized that they had never dreamed it possible that our little town should be chosen out for the scene of such grotesque happenings as the wholesale death of rats in broad daylight, or the decease of concierges through exotic maladies. In this respect they were wrong, and their views obviously called for revision. Still, if things had gone thus far and no farther, force of habit would doubtless have gained the day as usual. But other members of our community, not all menials or poor people, were to follow the path down which Monsieur Michel had led the way. And it was then that fear, and with fear serious reflection, began.